Hello, everyone. My name is Dave Peedy. I'm the current board president of Publishing Professionals Network. We are really excited for today's session. But before we dive into it, I just want to let you know we are recording this. And once we edit appropriately, which is not very much at all, we'll definitely be posting that and sharing it to the listserv of folks who are on our mailing list. You can go to pubpronetwork.org if you want to be on our mailing list. And if you want to join, being a PPN member is very reasonable. It's $25 a year for individuals. And I want to talk a little bit before we dive into today's session about what we do. So we put on sessions like this. We're an all volunteer nonprofit. So we're very fortunate to have someone who is as widely sought after as our presenter today. But we always try to have sessions like this where we bring in an expert, or sometimes we'll just come together as a community to share insights around something or someone, or some kind of software or some kind of issue that we're all struggling with. We also have a one-day conference in Berkeley that happens every year. This year it's happening on Friday, April 26th. The theme for the all-day session is Publishing for the Greater Good. You can go to our website in early February to sign up. We don't have the information yet, but you can save that date. And certainly if you're on our mailing list, we'll be providing information about that. We have about 9 sessions, plus a great keynote speaker planned for that. In the fall, we always have a book show featuring some of the best book design and printing and manufacturing. And it's a really wonderful event, and you can submit to that and you can attend the event. Okay, so enough of the PPN promotion. I hope if you're not a member, you'll definitely check us out. But I'm going to turn this over to David Van Ness, who is on our board, but also on our professional development team, to introduce today's speaker. So
today, we're really lucky to have Conrad Chavez speaking about Photoshop and using artificial intelligence with Photoshop. Conrad is the author of Adobe Photoshop Classroom in a Book, which is an Adobe Press title. In other words, he's the best source for Photoshop issues. I've worked with him on the book over many years. There's an edition each year that comes through. And I've participated with hundreds of other people in the Photoshop pre-release group that Adobe has. And the programmers and the experts at Adobe, when Conrad asks a question, they are very careful to answer it. So we're lucky to have him today. Conrad.
Well, thanks, David. That was a very nice introduction. And I have to say that David Van Ness is one of the most productive and efficient print production people I've ever run into. He knows what to do. He can handle any situation. We've been very lucky to have him. And of course, I am here to talk about AI within Photoshop, Adobe Photoshop. And I said it that way because so within the AI, Adobe's doing stuff, but within what Adobe's doing, Photoshop is its own thing, because Adobe is doing a whole bunch of different things. And I'm going to focus on Photoshop, but I will also kind of glance on what's going on outside Photoshop, because I think it's important to know that too. And yeah, I'm sure a lot of you have seen some wowie demos about what the cool things you can do and just conjure stuff out of thin air. But I want to talk about it in more of a practical way, especially since this is like the professional publishing network. We're all really interested in well, just how do I get stuff done? How do I get it out the door? How's this going to help me? But also the really obvious anxieties that are out there, like what's going on with rights and how easy is it for people to steal stuff. And but first, I will introduce myself a little bit more. Well, first of all, I'm older than I look. I got my start supporting something those of you who've been around a while may remember, Aldous Freehand, the drawing program that competed with Adobe Illustrator. And I got my start doing some tech support for that and some pre-release testing. And that was when software shipped on floppy disks. Kids, ask your parents. So I still got that stuff. And then from there, I guess I did a good enough job that they said, well, hey, do you want to help us out with supporting PageMaker, which was originally Aldus PageMaker, which got bought by Adobe, and then it turned into Adobe PageMaker. And that was tech support. And from there, I was kind of, it was kind of a baptism by fire of learning how publishing works. Like, how do you print on a press? What is CMYK all about? It can't print all the colors and all that stuff. And how does halftoning work? And since then, and then I worked actually for Aldus and Adobe until about 2000, when I decided I might be able to go out on my own. And I did. And ever since, I've been able to do that and been very lucky to have been asked to write many books and articles and videos about Adobe products, mostly Photoshop. So maybe about 15 years ago, some of you may know the name Bruce Fraser. He wrote the book series on the left, the Real World Adobe Photoshop series. And unfortunately, he realized that he got a cancer diagnosis, and he realized he wasn't going to be able to continue that series. And so he and his co-author asked me if I could take it over, and I did. So I did the editions for CS3, CS4, and CS5. And after that, I was asked to start doing the Adobe Photoshop Classroom in a book series by that series' previous author, Andrew Faulkner, who did a great job with it. And that is the book on the right, of course. Excuse me. And what you see there is the current version that David Van Ness and I just finished working on. And yeah, I'm really proud of it. And now, as far as like, am I here just to sell books? Not really, because a lot of you guys are probably really experienced with Photoshop, and the Photoshop Classroom in a book is really more for beginners. Or the other group would be people who have been away from Photoshop for a while, because especially Photoshop has changed a lot in the last 5 years. And if you've been away from it and you feel like you need to relearn it, maybe it's a book for you. But I'm not here to sell it, because I think most of you probably know a lot about Photoshop. Now, as far as even within AI, within Photoshop, there are a couple of kinds. There's just general AI, or that they've been marketing for a while, if you know about their neural filters and stuff. But now there's the new generative AI. And that word generative is really important, because that's what's really causing all the controversy and making people ask questions, because it's kind of a whole other level where it can generate images that you just have to ask for stuff. Like you've probably heard of Midjourney and those web services where you can type in a phrase and say, I want to see a gorilla on a skateboard skating going across a frozen lake, and you can get that. And that is what I'm going to focus more on today. And the way that it works, if you aren't that familiar with the concept yet, is that it is trained using a large set of data. They call it a large language model. And you tell it to do something, and if it gets it wrong, and of course, this is a gross oversimplification of the way it works technically, but you write what they call a prompt, a sentence, like the example I just used of give me a gorilla on a skateboard, and it returns a result, and it's probably not quite right. So if you're developing this, then you keep sort of showing it more examples of right and wrong, and when it gets it right, you kind of reinforce that in the software until it's pretty good most of the time, and then you put it out to the public and say, hey, you can just conjure stuff up with this. But it has to be trained. It has to be trained properly. And that has its own issues, the training does, because which images are being used, and who is deciding what the right and wrong results are. And those can vary by culture, or, well, mostly by culture. I mean, what I think the right result for something is, somebody from a different country might say, no, that's actually, you should never do that. And I think that's going to come up more and more as more countries and more cultures use AI, because right now it's mostly the West, and I suppose, and China actually is getting into it a lot. But I think there are going to be more situations where, like, if I'm traveling in another country and AI is doing something, it may judge me in a way that that's not how it works where I come from, which is here. And just so you know, I was born and raised here in Seattle, Washington, where Aldus and started out, and Microsoft and that kind of thing. But to get back to generative AI in Photoshop, um, yeah, I'm going to start with that, or go back to that anxiety I was talking about. If for those of you who are Star Trek fans, the way that AI works kind of looks a little bit like that villain, the Borg, in Star Trek: The Next Generation, because the tagline of that villain was that we will add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own. And I forgot to add the part about resistance is futile, because that's kind of a component of this too. And to a lot of people, that's kind of how this new generative AI works. For example, you put stuff out on the web, and is somebody gonna, or is not somebody, but is an AI gonna find your the website of your body of work and start copying it? And it's not just pictures. As publishers, many of you may know that generative AI is being heavily used in helping people write stories, or just writing stories without people. And it's starting to be applied to video, which I'll touch on later too. So it could be everything. And this is scary to me. I've been a nerd and a geek, and I'm into the tech, but I am a little bit kind of weirded out by the idea that in the future, the stuff I see, the stuff I hear, the stuff I'm watching is, how much of that is real. And now Adobe has some approaches to all of that, which is nice. But excuse me. But Adobe's not everybody. And so even though I'm going to show you some ways that Adobe is trying to address the ethical and moral issues of generative AI, because Adobe isn't everybody, I think we are all going to continue to struggle with this in the future, as we run to entities who have motivations other than just helping us get stuff done. So with that, let's see, what problems does generative AI solve? And when I think about it, this is just my perspective, is that as we talked about, something like Midjourney can create a whole image, but you can also use it to more easily than ever add elements you want or take them out. A lot of people love it for brainstorming, especially writers, and graphic artists too, and also repairing, just fixing things. And a lot of those can just be basic production tasks. You just want to fix stuff, get it right, get it out. So with that, I think I will start to go into Photoshop here. So let me share my screen, and let's see. Let this work right. We are in. So we're in Photoshop. This is a view that David's very familiar with, because we worked on this together. And it's a sample file that does come from the Classroom in a book, but I was using it to demonstrate a few things about how generative AI works in Photoshop. So I've got this layout, this composition, and basically the way it's set up is it's kind of like a teaser for a live stream or a video program. One thing I've done with the Classroom in a book is slowly bring in more non-print media, because it used to be all print, and of course it can't be all print anymore. And so in the whole composition, this building is a good place. And when the building picture was first brought in, it would have been, oh, I got the wrong tool there. You'd think I'd know how to do this. That's the picture as it was really originally brought in. In the final composition, it's not really centered well. And so, oh, I need to turn that off. It's not really centered properly. So, but if we move the picture to the middle to get it centered into this green part, assuming that's a standard part of somebody's template, the problem is there's no image over here. There's an empty space. Oops. And in the past, you either couldn't use it or you had to fill it with something. But the way that generative fill works in Photoshop is that you make a selection. And for those of you who aren't Photoshop whizzes, this is basically just saying, which pixels do I want to change? And Photoshop displays this thing at the bottom called it's called the contextual taskbar. I'll select again. And there's a new button here called Generative Fill. And a lot of this stuff is really new. It was not originally, it was only added like in the last year for not just for generative fill, because a lot of people think of this bar as the generative fill bar, and it's really not. It's the contextual task bar, which you can turn on and off here on the window menu. And basically, it changes its appearance and function depending on what's selected. But in this case, I want generative fill, so I'll click that. So what happens now? Kind of like Midjourney or something, it lets you type a text prompt. And it's got a little flashing text cursor in there, and you can see that the default text, it's not really entered, it's just a suggestion. What would you like to generate? And this is where, if you wanted to, you could type in stuff like, I want to see a brick wall, I want to see whatever. Now, how do you tell it to just do whatever you, to just fill it in without like just extend the background? And the way you do that, if you notice that the tooltip that came up when I moved the cursor over, it says, if you leave this blank, we'll fill the selection based on the surroundings. So yeah, okay, I'll leave it blank because that's all I want. So hit generate, and it takes a while. And technically, it'll take longer on an older computer or a computer with weaker graphics hardware. And, you know, I've got kind of a 2-year-old MacBook Pro based on the M1 Pro processor, which is kind of mid-range. And that's how long it took. This year's Macs, probably faster. Because it's heavily dependent on graphics hardware. Now, what happened here? Well, that's all filled in. And it kind of fits in. It looks like whatever this is. Now, you might think in some cases it's not quite right. I'll show you more about that in an example coming up. But notice that what happened here is we have a new layer down here called Generative Fill, and the Properties panel now has 3 items in the Variations group of, or section of the Properties panel. And this is kind of a smart thing. It gives you a chance to check out different versions in case the one that it put up first doesn't quite look right. So if I try the second one, I get that. And if I try the third one, I'm going to get that. So I just picked the one I like the most. And now what if I didn't like any of them? Well, then you could hit generate again, and it'll generate 3 more, and you can keep doing that. One thing you need to know about that, generating variations with, or just using generative fill technology at all takes resources up at the computers, at Adobe's servers. And if a lot of people decide they're just going to generate all day long, the servers could get really tied up and really slow. And so what Adobe does is they have this thing called generative credits, and you get a certain amount per month depending on your Creative Cloud plan. And so I think for now, well, I'm not going to give a number because it depends on the plan. I think it's 100 for most people, but it may be different for school or organizational plans. So you do need to kind of not overuse it. And also the fact that they put this on a layer is great because it doesn't mess with the original image. You can turn that layer off and work with it separately. And now, of course, this does bring up some issues, like with this particular image, I'm using it in this example for just a graphic illustration for a promo for video. And okay, that's fine. But if this was going to be used for journalism or education, like in a textbook, I would probably try and find a different solution than using generative fill, because this is a historical site. And so people may use it for research. And so it may be used for in cases where you want to reinforce some facts. I don't want to be all about misinformation. I want to be about accuracy. So maybe for that, I would not use generative fill, and I would just kind of find a different picture or redo the composition somehow or something, because of course, these aren't real. And to kind of push that along a little further, what if you want to add something new? Let me select this area, and I'll just use a different selection tool to show that it kind of doesn't really matter what you do here. It still says generative fill, and I'll hit that. And I'll type in, let's see, how about horse with chariot and driver, because that would be cool. So much of tech is about what's cool. And it's going to figure that out. I did this earlier, and I'm actually kind of curious to see how different the results are this time. And again, we're waiting a while, just because it's both talking to Adobe and figuring stuff out. And we get this, and I'm like, okay, it's all right, but I don't know, the detail level isn't great. We're almost missing a leg. How about the other variations? Okay, it's a little better, but the wheel's weird. And I just have to say that I keep running into this. I am a photographer, and I do take my own pictures, and I'm not really a graphic designer where I make stuff from scratch. So I don't really personally need to use it for making up new elements. But if you do, you can see that you have to check this stuff really closely. Adobe is aware that it's not perfect, but there are cases where it works way better than this. This is just not one of those cases. I'm just not going to use this. Oh, and when I was talking about expanding the canvas or expanding the image, there's another way to do this. Why don't I put this guy back in the, oops, that's, and actually, what I'm going to do is show the whole image because I really, oops, there we go. Actually, you know what I really need to do is just open this in its own window. So this is the imported image. In the original document, this is actually placed, for those of you who know Photoshop, this is placed as a smart object. And to really show what I'm going to show, I should open that up into the source image. And what I'm going to show now is another way that Adobe has implemented generative fill is in the crop tool. So for example, if I want to extend this a different way, then I could just grab the crop handle and go out. But what I want to do, see, by default, it's going to make a transparent hole for that extended part. But if I wanted to sort of extend it by cropping, then I would go up to the options bar here, where it's that tooltip says how expanded crop area gets filled. They had a content aware option, or they have, it's not past tense, it's still there. But they added generative expand, which can work better. So I'm going to choose that. And then I'm going to apply the crop to the old check mark here. You can also press the return or enter key. And once again, it's going to think about it and figure out how to make it fill in with the rest here. And we will see what it comes up with when it's done. And here's the result. Again, we get 3 variations. So in this case, instead of selecting an area that was empty and filling it in, what I did was extend the canvas with the crop tool and used the generative expand option to fill it in. And this does fall, this can fall under the category of a production related AI. And by the way, I just personally have a term called production AI. I call it that because it might help me in production to solve a problem. And I point that out because when you use AI in this way to solve a problem, you're not doing that thing that people complain about where you're stealing other people's styles or work. I mean, not, you might be if this wasn't, if you just kind of took this picture and were using it without permission. But for example, if I had a photograph, if it was my photograph and I just wanted to, I need to have it 16:9 for a TV, but I didn't shoot it that way. And that's actually kind of what happened here. This was originally not a 16:9 image, and that's why we had to recompose it. In this way, I'm not like turning it into an oil painting or making it look like Picasso or something. I may be expanding my own image. And for that, I like to think of it as a practical, non-controversial use of AI. And I really like that Photoshop went in this direction of focusing a lot in Photoshop on types of generative AI that would actually help you get your work done. They also added another form of generative AI is they added something called the remove tool, which is here. It's grouped with the other. If you've used the spot healing brush tool or the healing brush or patch tool, it's in this tool group, the remove tool. And it uses generative AI to figure out how to take out objects. So I'm just kind of setting my brush size. Like if I want to take out some of these rocks, stones, I just brush over them, and again, it thinks about it a lot, and then it takes them out, and hopefully it fills them in with something plausible. And you might say, yeah, I was doing that with the clone stamp tool, or I was doing that with the healing brush tool, and I don't see why this is new. And actually, in this example that I just did right here, and I'm kind of curious as to why it's taking so long. Maybe it's the network bandwidth. Um, this is not that hard to do by hand. However, if you want to take out some sections of this wall here, this would be more challenging to take out by hand because you got to match these different kinds of bricks. In fact, I don't know. Let me and it's kind of interesting because I haven't actually done this. I didn't do this part before. I didn't rehearse this part, so I'm going to just see what it's like. So I'm using the healing brush tool, which used to be a pretty good way of doing this, and it still is, but you can see that I still have to work to get all the right parts from over on the left. I'm sampling. I should explain what I'm doing. I'm sampling areas on the left, and I want to put on the right, and it's okay, but it takes a lot of work. So I'm going to undo that a few times. And this time we'll try the remove tool. And I'm just going to paint over it, and we'll see what happens. And this is where the remove tool should shine. Okay, see, it just did it right away. It took a second after it was thinking about it. And there was no sampling. There was nothing except just painting over the area. And it figured out how to make this course of stones match and that. And this, to me, is a really powerful production tool. And one of the best uses of generative AI in Photoshop, I think. But there, as far as the issues about this, there are two main rights-related things that this brings up. One is, I heard that, people will say, I heard that generative AI basically scrapes the whole web and for its training examples. And so everybody's images are being used without permission to build these things that companies like Adobe are profiting from. And that is kind of true for many of the AI models out there. But for, I think maybe I'll put myself back on for, oops, gee, I didn't mean to touch anything there. But for Adobe, where are they getting their images? And that's a big a question. And Adobe has tried to address this side of it by saying, look, we're only going to train our AI images from public domain images and also our own Adobe stock library. And so it's like, oh, okay. So, and the reason they want to do that is so they can tell everybody, we have the rights to everything, or it's public domain, so the copyright's expired, and that'll put us in the clear. That's what Adobe says, and that is quite reassuring. But I think it, and not just me, but I think other people also feel that by restricting themselves to playing nicely, that may be why their models are not quite at the level of some of the other ones. There are some people that say, "Oh no, I'm still going to use Midjourney or whatever," because sometimes those images turn out better than some of the examples I showed you, like that sort of the half-baked chariot and rider. Because I've also I asked for a jetliner, and it gives me engines and fins in weird places and stuff sometimes. Sometimes it's fine, sometimes it's not. But at least for Adobe, generative AI is not quite at the level that it can replace stock photos. And you might be saying, yeah, well, does Adobe want it to? Because Adobe runs Adobe stock. And but Adobe depends on Adobe stock to train their images, so they need to keep encouraging high quality submissions. Okay, I got to clear my throat there. But the other side of this is there's this huge deal where, as publishers, you may be aware that your clients, a lot of them, are really, really tight about image rights and licensing. Like, for example, even for our own Photoshop Classroom in a book that David Van Ness and I work on, the publisher wants a very detailed listing of every image we used in the book, where the rights, and whatever. And it's become a lot easier for me to make new illustrations out of images from the publisher's own stock library, because then it's very easy to get them and they've got all the rights. Now, the way that, and the way this affects generative AI in Photoshop is you want to make an image for a huge company like Procter and Gamble or something, and I'm just throwing that name out there. I don't know if they do this. They probably do. But their legal team is probably going to say, listen, are you using this generative AI feature at all in anything? Because we don't want any legal trouble. We don't need people suing us because we put out an ad that had a picture that would obviously had elements from some copyrighted material. You can't use generative AI. And then the artists are going to go, oh, geez, that was going to save me hours of time. But the way Adobe has addressed this is they came out with, and I should have dug this up before the meeting, but and you can look it up if you want, but Adobe has put out a policy of indemnifying, if I can even say the word, indemnifying their large customers against Adobe or claims against their AI. So for example, if you were a big company and somebody sued you and it turned out that it was something used in an image made by Photoshop, Adobe says, we'll pay your legal costs. And that sounds great. And the thing is, there's two aspects to that. First, Adobe is confident enough in the provenance of the images that they're gathering for training their generative AI that they feel like they can back you up with a bunch of lawyers. And that's great. It means they're really confident that they're solid. But I do need to point out the fine print there. The indemnification that they announced was for major, like I think it was enterprise accounts. So that means, for example, me working on my publishing projects, I'm not an enterprise account. I'm a single user license. I don't think their army of lawyers is going to back me up. So just keep that in mind. You know, if your clients are large, they may be happy with that, but there still may be an element of risk there. The other issue that's come up is that on some like internet forums, like Reddit, people have been pointing out that they're finding images on Adobe stock that are AI generated and seem to be, and the problem is, well, okay, first of all, Adobe does have a little tag they can add to something on Adobe stock saying this is AI generated. And I'm going to show you that in a sec. But the problem is that people are entering searches for certain artists to get something that looks like their style, and they're getting AI images in Adobe stock that are of that style. And the one that I tried this myself the other day, and in this example, I typed in the name of Juan Miro, an artist that I know, just from art school, and it brought me this was one of the results, and this is not by him. It says here generated with AI. And now the good news is they told me it was generated by AI. The bad news is I found it using his name. It's not his work. It looks a lot like his work, maybe good enough that someone might want to use it. I don't know. And also he passed away a while ago, like 40 years ago. And this is the kind of thing people are talking about. It's like, but wait a minute, I'm a small-time graphic designer, and I'm finding, and when I do my own search on Adobe stock, I get all these AI-generated versions of my work that are not me. Now, I'm not sure. Well, I know that Adobe hasn't totally addressed that because I was able to do that last search myself the other day. I'm sure they've got people on it. And so that is an issue here is one of moderation. And it's that word moderation is something that's coming up in a lot of different contexts. Like for example, misinformation on Facebook or other social networks or Instagram and stuff if people post stuff that's defamatory or misleading or painting a certain group in the wrong light politically, how do you get rid of that? And everybody's struggling with it. How do you tell the good from the bad? How do you weed it out without compromising free speech for everybody? So this is so even though Adobe has solved some of those problems, they're going to run into the same moderation issues that the social media networks are, just because of the nature of the thing. The other rights issue that comes up is what about knowing if something is AI generated? And again, I'm going to share my screen here because I want to show you, for example, I'm going to go into the settings here, and I'm going to pull up the settings for content credentials. And what content credentials are is it tries to address the other side of the issue, which is I'm looking at an image on the web. Is it real? How do I know it was whether or not it was generated with AI? And so an industry movement, uh, content content verification has come up, and there is a multi-organization group that has been working on standards for tagging images as AI or not. But not just that. I mean, you may already know that documents can have metadata like keywords, description, caption, copyright. But it's really easy to change that stuff and nobody knows it. So one of the advantages of content credentials, which you can see here is, at least in Photoshop, is still in beta, is to make it tamper evident. In other words, if somebody changes the information, you should be able to see it and be able to tell. And so in Photoshop, they do give you now the option of embedding content credentials into the images you create in Photoshop. And the way this is supposed to work is if you turn this on, then Photoshop will start recording and tracking and embedding into the images who edited it, using what software, and was generative AI used. And where you see this is on the other end. And let me go open that. So File, Export, Export As. In this export dialog box, there's a content credentials section down here. And you can see that if you want to embed it, well, first of all, you can embed copyright and contact info if it's in the image. But if you enabled the content credentials in the preferences, then it will also add them. And what does that look like? Well, they got a little preview button here. Let me back out. People will be able to view the following information with your content. In other words, the copy that's exported from here. This image combines multiple pieces of content. At least one was generated with an AI tool. Okay. And then some other stuff here. Oh, looks like it was made with Adobe Photoshop 25.3.1. The AI model used was Adobe Firefly, and that's made by Adobe. Okay, that's nice. But wait a minute. After I export this, where do I see it? I think for that, I think I need to share a different window to show you that. I mean, if you want to look yourself, there's this website called verified.org. I'm just setting it up on my browser too, so I can show you here, and then I'll share that. Okay, looks like it's coming up, so I thought it was. Because what I'm trying to show you is how you can check for, it's funny, why isn't this thing coming up? Well, I'll talk through it while I'm trying to bring it up. That's funny. That's odd. Anyway, on the web, there's a website called verify.org, and you can throw images into it, and it will pop up a similar info window saying, the software created it, it used generative AI, or at least some elements do. And that'll get tricky because if it's some elements, it's like, which elements? I don't think it's that detailed. But in other words, it's set up so that if you're viewing an image in a web browser, and you can throw it into this website, and it will reveal to you the image that was embedded by content credentials. Now, again, this has the limitations of Adobe's doing it and some other companies are doing it, but not everybody's doing it. So the majority of images on the web are still, they don't have this kind of information, and you still have to guess if that is really what, if you see a post about, hey, they just blew up all these people, and it's like, I don't know if that's real. I'm not sure. I don't know what to think. Content credentials will help us to know what to think when we can see that info, but for everything else, it's still going to be kind of a Wild West. Let's see, where are we going from here? So we've covered some of the ways that Adobe's trying to address all the different anxieties and pain points that on the creator side, they want you to know that Adobe generative AI comes from what they claim to be ethical sourcing. And on the export side, they want you to know that you can let other people know whether your image has it or not. And although I said earlier that most images won't have it, the advantage of having it is that if you see that an image has content credentials that says Gen AI was used, you can say no. But it also, on the other side, gives you more confidence that if you are able to see content credentials for an image and it says and that there was no Gen AI used, then you know that that is a realistic image, or at least hasn't been altered. Oh, and by the way, when I said earlier that the metadata for that was tamper evident, that is so if somebody tried to mess with that metadata and you know, like, oh, they want to take off the thing that says generative AI was used, if they messed with it, then there's kind of a checksum like you get with NFTs where it would reveal that it had been messed with, so that even though you would not be sure, at least you were sure that you couldn't trust the image because it revealed tampering. I want to leave enough time for questions, so I'm gonna let's see. I'm gonna switch to. I want to talk a little about how Gen AI is being used in some other Adobe apps, and so I'm gonna set some stuff up here. Oh, yeah. So in Illustrator, if you use Adobe Illustrator, there is these, by the way, I just to save time, I pulled up an article that I wrote for Creative Pro magazine, which I write for. It it is a subscription, but what I really like about Creative Pro magazine is that it's super production oriented. It really appeals to that practical side of me. It's not just a bunch of like, oh, hey, you know, there's this cool new thing. It'll tell you what's cool about it and how it's going to fit into your production workflow. And I talk about accessibility and print production and all this stuff. But in an article I recently wrote where I was summarizing what happened at the last Adobe Max conference, I wrote this article, which was about what basically tried to summarize what Adobe announced, because it's just too big of a conference to kind of digest at once. I tried to distill it down. But what I'm showing here is this is in Adobe Illustrator, and they have a new feature called Generative Recolor. And they're using generative AI to try and intelligently generate alternate color palettes for vector graphics that you have in Illustrator. So that's, and again, you can type in a prompt of what kind of color scheme you want, and it'll kind of interpret that, and hopefully you'll get something you like. Again, I don't know, maybe you have variations because you might not like them all. And also, it's really important to point out that although many of us, being professionals, use the Adobe Professional line, which is Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator, things are a lot different than when I started out with PageMaker and Freehand. Back then, those of you who were there at the time, remember, you had to, if you wanted to get something done, you bought a layout program, $500 to get Photoshop, $500, Illustrator, $500, and then you learn how to use them. And how do I do a drop shadow? And, you know, maybe in 1992, it was like, well, you open Photoshop and you do some channel stuff and then some blurring. And then you kind of, you know, it was like 20 steps to do a drop shadow. But what Adobe is figuring out is that with the technology today, people don't have to go through what we had to go through necessarily. I mean, I'm not saying that it's going to be as good as what somebody with skills would do. But for example, they're leaning heavily on their Adobe Firefly service on the web. Now, I'd call it innovation, but it's not really. The reason Adobe had to dive headfirst into consumer-oriented graphics with one click is, and supported by AI, is that there were other applications such as Canva that came in and were doing that. They were coming in and saying, look, we've got easy templates and you don't have to learn all that stuff. And it works fine for most people, the people that just need to do social media posting or simple flyers. And it's not good for those of us who may have used some of those projects as our bread and butter, but it does democratize graphic design. And all of us need to upskill and get to other levels of this, because these cheaper, smaller jobs were going away anyway because if they get outsourced to different countries. But now even the outsourcers may be in trouble now that what happened here, I really should explain this. all that happened here was I typed out a couple of lines of text in Firefly and then picked a text effect, and it was able to it's not applied as an even pattern. It's kind of adapting to the shape and stuff like that. So and yeah, it also doesn't say that I did this with a prompt too. I typed in Safari style and it applied this to some text that was formerly just solid black. So Adobe Illustrator is picking up a couple of features like you saw with the generative recolor and oh, I'm sorry, I switched from Illustrator to Firefly, but Firefly is leaning heavily on AI. It used to be purely template based with some intelligence. Now they're putting AI into it and putting some mid-journey style effects into it too. Also, if you're really interested in what's happening in AI, so far I've shown what happens when you type text in and it gives you something back. Well, and so you may have heard that there's this new sort of profession of prompt engineering, when you learn how to write the kind of sentence that gets you the kind of results you want. And that might not be the longest lived profession because not everybody, a lot of people recognize that we don't all work in words. We don't all work in text. A lot of us are visual people, especially the people in this meeting. So Adobe, and other companies, are working on how do we let people do a prompt that's not visual. And if you're interested in this stuff, you can go review the Adobe Sneaks videos from the last Adobe Max conference, because I thought they were more amazing than I thought they would be, but also and a little scary because they had ideas for ways to get AI going that don't necessarily involve typing text. But I'm just going to very quickly, to leave time for questions, jet through some of the things that Adobe showed. They showed something called Project Fast Fill, where the Gen AI, you would select something in a video, like somebody's tie, and it would replace the tie. But it's not just that it replaced it. It changed the replacement shape as the guy was walking down the street. And so it was adaptive like that. And they have Project Draw and Delight. And by the way, these are all projects. They're not products yet. They're working on them. They may or may not show up in an Adobe product. You scribble some sketchy strokes in the certain colors you want, and then you tell it what you want out of that, like a cat, and it will generate it based on your suggesting sketches. And let's see, it was easier 3D thing, but there was another project where they showed somebody took two different videos and the AI combined them, reconciled the perspectives, and composited them. And so that's an example of how AI is going to affect video. Let's see, that wasn't really AI, so I'll skip that one. In this one, more of it for typographers, you draw 3 type characters as a style reference, and this technology generates the rest of the font from that. And then there's no one for 3D posing, where you show it a reference image with a pose you want your 3D figure to match, and it makes the 3D figure match the pose. And so maybe like it's a video of me sitting in a chair or me cooking, and it'll apply that to the 3D model. And then there's one where AI translates, not only does translation between languages, but makes the translation match the voice of the speaker, which is both really cool and super, super scary. Wow, there's some stuff here. I mentioned Firefly. Kind of using this as a hint to see if I left anything out in this talk too. Oh, here's an example of content credentials on the web. This might be an older version because I think it looks cooler now, but this is an example of I generated this image of a plane and I put it in that, it was contentcredentials.org. Maybe I was using the wrong URL. And this is the image I threw into the website, and it said, here's some stuff about it. It did use Adobe Firefly Generative AI in Photoshop 25.2. So, well, there's that example. This may be, one more thing. So they're basing training on Adobe stock images. Do the people who put those images in get anything? And they do have what they call Firefly contributor bonus. And they have a fact for, if you've submitted images to Adobe stock, there's a fact online for Adobe stock contributors telling them what kind of compensation they might get. if their images are used in the Firefly generative AI model. So they're also trying to adjust that anxiety of you're using my I submitted images to Adobe Stock. You're using my images. Aren't you going to pay me for training with them? And that's their answer. And so with less than 10, oh yeah. So basically, I know that the brief for the talk was, are there any historical reasons to not feel so bad, so freaked out about this stuff? Some of it I've covered, that there are some companies like Adobe that are trying to build some guardrails and safeguards into how their AI works, but the downside is not everybody's going to do that, and not every government is going to do that. But the other one is about the jobs. Yeah, AI is going to put certain people out of work or have less jobs for everybody in some areas. But where I get some hope is that for several hundred years since the Industrial Revolution, there's been technology after technology that's come in, and people were afraid that there would be no more jobs, going all the way back to the automated looms that they put in England during the original Industrial Revolution, which is where the term Luddite came from. And they weren't against technology. They were against actually the removal of their jobs by a machine. And we thought that was going to happen with factories. We thought it was going to happen with computers in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And where I get a little bit of hope from is that today, at least, I know it's not true everywhere, but at least in the United States, the unemployment rate is shockingly low for having thought that we have more technology than ever, but the employment rate is pretty high. And I know they're not all good jobs, so I'm not saying it's perfect. But technology did not take away all those jobs. So hopefully eventually we'll figure out where we can still make money if if generative AI in general is getting better and better at doing more things that people used to get paid to do. And okay, well, I knew that I could talk on and on about this, but we've only got an hour. So at this point, I think I'll go to the chat and see what kind of questions have been coming up, if there have been, because I know David said that they were going to show up there.
Yeah, why don't I go ahead and read some?
Yeah.
Some you've answered. One is sort of a good production question, which is, what's the maximum resolution generative AI will work? Does this work on 16-bit images? And then a second part of the question is, when do you get charged an AI credit? When you save or when you click on something to try?
Okay, the first question was about limitations. There are some limitations. One of them is resolution. In the first version of Firefly being used in Photoshop, I think it's 1024 pixels, which is not a lot. And so that's another, in addition to the question, the sketchy quality, sometimes that's another reason some people are like, I'm going to keep using Midjourney at whatever dollars a month, because they can generate a higher resolution image. Now, I think at Adobe Max, Adobe said that their next iteration of Firefly was going to let them increase that. But I should have checked to see if that's happened yet. It may not have. If they were going to increase it, I'm not even sure if it was going to go to full resolution yet, but I'm sure that that's what they want to do. The second question was about when you get charged a generative credit. And that happens when you click the generate button. Every time you click the generate button in Photoshop, is my understanding. In other words, it's not for each variation. I think it's just, you should check the FAQ on that they would have, but because there is a generative credits FAQ online, and I'm pretty sure it's every time you click the generate button, but not for every variation. Another time, I think is using it. Oh man, do they do the remove tool? I'm supposed to know this. But I know that it's pretty restricted to those things right now in Photoshop. It's not everything. It's just because, again, there are different kinds of generative AI, there are different kinds of AI in Photoshop, but generative credits are really only applying definitely to the generate AI button and or generative fill button. And you should just basically look for features that have the word generative in them, because I also think that generative expand would probably cost a credit, and maybe the remove tool. But let's move on to some other questions, though.
One of the questions that has come up in people expressing interest in this session is, is generative AI also what they're using to improve resolution? So Photoshop over many iterations has gotten better and better about upresing. And is any of this AI being used for that, and can we use it better than what it might be doing on its own? And there are all these other plugins, right? Other uses where you can take everyone's saying you can upres something. Are those, or is Photoshop still at the front of that?
Let's see. I switched to Photoshop because Photoshop has an image size command, and under that, when you resize an image, there are some options for how to resize it, and none of these use current AI. Some of these are purely algorithmic. These are bicubic is really old, so I don't think it's being used here. There is a feature called neural filters, which uses a lot of AI. The one that can be used for upscaling is super zoom, and so if you zoom this, if you decide to zoom this in and for upscaling it, like I hit 3x here, it is going to use generative, or it's using AI. It may or may not be in what Adobe calls the generative category, but I know that this is the closest thing inside Photoshop right now to for example, Topaz Gigapixel AI. Now I said in Photoshop because there's another place where really recent AI is being used, and that's in Adobe Camera Raw when you use the enhance feature, and it's super resolution there is what they call it. That does use a very recent AI. It's really effective. So there's lots of ways to resize in Photoshop, but I think only super zoom and neural filters and enhance in Camera Raw are using really recent AI that might compete with standalone AI resizers.
Okay. So contentcredentials.org, somebody put in the chat as being the one to use.
Yeah, that's what I noticed here in the example I showed. Is it was that one.
And then the other thing that I want, you talked a little bit about jobs and are we being replaced by generative AI or AI in general? And I think one of the things that we all know is that AI is going to be a part of our future. And so being able to use AI as best we can, one of those things is knowing how to refine the statements that or the requests that we're using, prompts. Can you talk a little bit about how, especially maybe you personally have learned how to, when you get not a great result from your prompt, how to refine that prompt? And part two of that question is, whenever you pick an area of a photo to use generative AI on, can you talk a little bit about the importance of the size and shape of what the area that you've selected?
Okay, so for the first one, how to shape a text prompt. Yeah, that was that prompt engineering skill that I talked about. And frankly, I'm not the best at that. I think I would, because as I said earlier, as a photographer, I have not been using it to generate new content as much. I tend to want my photos to be what I actually took, maybe with a few repairs that are really minor, but I'm not the best at that. I think I would probably do a little more research on the web. And also, and as I pointed out, in the future, we may be doing less of the text type of prompting, but yeah, that skill is going to be important in the short term. The second was about how does the selection affect what you generate? My impression anyway is that the area you select is mostly about telling Photoshop what area you want to fill in. It will normally look outside that selection for clues on how to fill it in from the picture that it's on. And so I don't think that the size and shape, I mean, what I would say is that you want to not select much more than the area you want to change, because you don't want to, because that would both reduce the rest of the area that it can kind of figure out what it needs to do, but it would also unnecessarily increase the amount of area that got changed. If you'd like to retain as much of the original image as you can, I'd say kind of make it a tight selection.
Thank you. And then someone asked for giving proper credit, especially say, for instance, on a book cover design. If the designer used generative AI to make adjustments to the image, what's the best way to indicate that? I mean, you talked about sort of the digital stamping, but in terms of giving credit, is there a sort of a generally accepted, this is best practices? So specifically, how to write the image credit of something that's partly or fully AI generated?
Well, you know what? That's one where I don't know. I'm actually not sure how you would do that on a like on a copyright page in a book or in or in the credit line under a photo. I haven't actually thought about that at all. It's probably something that's going to be worked out by by the lawyers that vet, what the publisher is supposed to say in the text and by the image. Yeah, I don't know. I'd like to know too now.
Well, it's interesting because this is also in the text world. So I know that at our conference, for instance, we're having a session on sort of some legal issues around AI, and I'm sure they're comparable, but I'm sure they'll be different for text versus graphics and that kind of stuff. Same as for moving images, right? So
Yeah.
last one, it's 1:03, so we've already gone over a little over our time. What has people's experience been working with publishers and using AI on cover design? So that's less of questions for you and to the community, because I think it's a really interesting question about the interplay, especially between freelancers and publishing companies. It could be within a staff of a publishing company, but I think I'm always surprised at, even with some of the larger publishing clients that I've had, how they're not necessarily out in front of this, of any of these kinds of things, and they sometimes are looking to a freelancer to tell them how it should be credited. So maybe that's something we as an organization need to sort of poll our community and find out what their thoughts are on this, and then both the publishers and the freelancers. I'm gonna stop it here and say that if folks have questions, feel free to send it to operations@pubpronetwork.org. We will be posting a video of this, and we'll include in the description of that video on YouTube any links that we think might be appropriate for things that we've been talking about here today. Once again, thank you so much, Conrad, for taking the time. Thank you, David Van Ness, for making this possible, for all the folks on this team. And thank you for the community for showing up, and take care.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Conrad.
You're welcome.